He thought the mine was worthless, just another burden from a grandfather who died alone in the mountains. But when he broke through the sealed tunnel, everyone warned him to leave alone. What he found in the darkness wasn't just rocks and dust. It was $300 million worth of legacy, danger, and a secret that powerful men had killed to protect. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning frost clung to everything in Copper Ridge like a warning. Marcus Brennan stood at the edge of his grandfather's property, breath misting in the thin mountain air, staring at the entrance to a mine that hadn't been touched in decades. At least, that's what everyone in town had told him. The old man's dead, they'd said over coffee at Ruth's diner, practically sneering into their cups. Left that boy nothing but debt, and a hole in the mountain that stopped producing ore back in 1978. Marcus was 31 years old, but standing there in his worn Carhartt jacket and steel-toed boots caked with mud, he felt about 100. The last 5 years had been a slow slide into nothing. His construction job dried up when the housing market collapsed. His wife left when the bank took the house. And now he was living in a camper trailer on 20 acres of Colorado scrubland, trying to figure out how a man rebuilds a life from kindling and anger. The call had come 3 weeks ago, a lawyer's voice, flat and professional, telling him that his grandfather, Vincent Brennan, had passed away at the age of 89, died in his sleep up in the cabin near the old mine. No one had found him for 4 days. Marcus hadn't seen the old man in over a decade, not since he was a teenager. His parents had cut ties with Vincent years before that. Something about a falling out Marcus never fully understood. All he remembered was a quiet man with calloused hands, smelled like tobacco and mineral dust, who once let him hold a chunk of raw silver ore and said, "Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones people stop looking for." Now that man was gone, and Marcus was the sole heir to whatever was left. The lawyer had been blunt about it. 20 acres of mountain land, a dilapidated cabin, and an abandoned mine with no active claims and back taxes owed. It wasn't an inheritance, it was a liability. But Marcus had nothing else. No job, no family, no prospects. So he signed the papers, packed what little he owned, and drove his rusted Ford pickup up the winding mountain roads to Copper Ridge, a town so small it made other small towns feel like cities. Population 342, and most of them looked at him like he was a ghost the moment he arrived. The first person to speak to him was Dale, the owner of the only gas station for 30 miles. He'd been pumping diesel when Marcus pulled up, and his eyes had gone wide. "You're Vincent's grandson," Dale said. Not a question, just a statement heavy with something Marcus couldn't name. "Yeah," Marcus replied. "Just got here." Dale nodded slowly, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. "Heard about the mine. Folks around here, they say you'd be smart to sell the land and walk away. That place, it ain't brought nothing but trouble." Marcus had heard versions of that same warning a dozen times since arriving. At the general store, at the post office, even from the woman who ran the small cafe where he'd grabbed breakfast. Everyone seemed to know about the mine, and everyone seemed certain it was worthless, cursed, or both. But what they didn't know was that Marcus had already looked at the property records. The mine had been sealed in 1976, 2 years before production supposedly stopped. His grandfather had filed the paperwork himself, citing safety concerns and structural instability. But there was something odd about it. The language was vague, almost deliberately so. And in the decades since, Vincent had never sold the land, never tried to reopen the mine, never even let surveyors onto the property. He'd just lived up there alone, a hermit in the mountains, working odd jobs and keeping to himself. Why? What had the old man been protecting? Or hiding? Marcus spent the first week clearing out the cabin. It was a small structure, barely 900 square feet, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to silver gray. Inside, it smelled like wood smoke and age. Vincent's belongings were sparse: a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with books about geology and mining, and a single photograph tacked to the wall. The photo showed a younger Vincent, maybe 40 years old, standing in front of the mine entrance with another man Marcus didn't recognize. Both were smiling, covered in dust, holding pickaxes. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "Last good day, 1975. Marcus stared at that photo for a long time, trying to piece together a story from a single image and a handful of words. Whatever had happened between that photo and the mine's ceiling a year later had changed everything. He found the first journal on the 5th day. It was tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the bed, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages inside were filled with Vincent's tight, careful handwriting. Most of it was technical: ore samples, tunnel measurements, equipment maintenance logs. But scattered throughout were stranger entries, notes that didn't fit the pattern. Sealed the East Tunnel today. No one can know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. They came asking again. Told them the same thing. Mines. Empty. Nothing left. They didn't believe me, but they can't prove otherwise. If something happens to me, I hope whoever finds this understands. Some things are worth more than money. Some things are dangerous in the wrong hands. Marcus read those entries over and over, his heart beating faster with each pass. His grandfather hadn't sealed the mine because it was empty. He'd sealed it because it wasn't. The next morning, Marcus loaded his truck with gear: flashlights, rope, a crowbar, work gloves, and a respirator mask he'd borrowed from Dale. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just drove up the old access road, barely more than 2 ruts in the dirt, until he reached the mine entrance. It sat in the shadow of a rocky cliff face, a dark mouth framed by rotting timber supports. A rusted chain hung across the opening, and a weathered sign read, "Danger. No. Trespassing. Structural collapse risk." But when Marcus stepped closer, he noticed something odd. The chain wasn't rusted through. It was relatively new, maybe 5 or 10 years old. And the padlock, though dusty, was modern. Someone had been maintaining this recently. His hands shook slightly as he pulled the key from his pocket. He'd found it in the cabin, hanging on a nail behind the door, with a tag that simply said East. The key slid into the padlock like it had been waiting for him. The lock clicked open, and the chain fell away with a heavy rattle that echoed into the darkness beyond. Marcus switched on his flashlight and stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, the air cool and dry, carrying the mineral smell of deep earth. The tunnel was wider than he'd expected, maybe 10 feet across, with timber supports every dozen feet running as far as his light could reach. The floor was surprisingly clear, no major cave-ins, no debris piles blocking the way. Someone had been taking care of this place. The beam of his flashlight caught something on the wall, about 20 feet in. He moved closer and felt his breath catch. Fresh tool marks, the kind you get from a pickaxe or chisel, and they weren't decades old. They were recent. Days, maybe weeks. Marcus pressed his palm against the rock wall and felt a tremor run through him, not from the earth, but from realization. His grandfather had been working this mine right up until he died, which meant there was something here worth working for. He moved deeper, his boots echoing in the silence. The main tunnel continued straight for what felt like 200 feet before branching into smaller side passages. Most were marked with faded paint: North Shaft, unstable; South Vein, tapped out; West Passage, closed 1969. But there was one branch that had no marking at all. It veered sharply to the left, and unlike the others, it had a makeshift wall built across its entrance. Not a cave-in, not a natural collapse. A deliberate barrier made from stacked stones and mortar. Marcus approached slowly, his light playing across the surface. Someone had built this by hand, carefully, with intent. And recently, someone had been inspecting it. He could see fresh mortar in the cracks, new stones fitted into gaps. His grandfather's work. There was no lock, no chain, just solid stone. But at the base, partially hidden by shadow, Marcus spotted something. A small brass plate, maybe 3 inches square, set into the rock. He knelt down and brushed away the dust. Engraved on the plate were 3 words: not yet. Wait. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind racing. Wait for what? How long? His grandfather had been waiting for more than 40 years, and now he was gone. Which meant, if Marcus didn't open this, no one would. He stood up, gripped the crowbar, and positioned it against the edge of one of the stones. Then, he stopped. From somewhere deep in the tunnel beyond the wall, he heard a sound, faint, almost imagined. A low hum, rhythmic, like water flowing over stone. But there was no water in these mountains. Not this high, not this deep. He pressed his ear against the barrier and listened. The hum continued, steady and patient, like the mountain itself was breathing. Marcus worked for 3 hours that first day, carefully prying stones from the barrier one at a time. He didn't rush. Something about the way his grandfather had built this wall told him to go slow, to respect what was hidden behind it. By the time the sun was setting outside, he'd removed enough stones to create a small opening, maybe 2 feet square. He shone his flashlight through the gap. On the other side was another tunnel, but this one was different. The walls weren't rough-hewn rock. They were smooth, almost polished, and they glimmered faintly in the light, as if dusted with something that caught and reflected the beam. He reached through the opening and ran his fingers along the surface. They came away covered in fine powder that sparkled like crushed glass. His heart began to pound. He knew that shimmer. Every kid who grew up in mining country knew it. Mica, quartz, and if he wasn't mistaken, something else, something rarer. He pulled his hand back and stared at the glittering dust on his fingers. Then he heard footsteps behind him in the main tunnel. Marcus spun around, flashlight swinging wildly. The beam caught a figure standing about 30 feet away, silhouetted against the dim glow of the entrance. "You shouldn't be in here," the voice said. Male, rough, unfamiliar. Marcus's pulse hammered in his ears. "This is my property," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure stepped forward into the light. He was older, maybe 60, with a weathered face and cold eyes. He wore a canvas jacket and heavy boots, and his hands were shoved deep in his pockets. "Property don't mean much if you don't know what you're standing on," the man said. Vincent knew. That's why he kept people out. Marcus tightened his grip on the crowbar. "Who are you?" "Name's Garrett. I worked with your grandfather back in the day, before he sealed this place up and stopped talking to everyone." Garrett's eyes flicked to the partially dismantled wall, and something dark passed across his face. "You shouldn't have started digging." "Why not?" Marcus asked, his voice sharp. Garrett was quiet for a long moment, his gaze locked on the glittering dust still visible on Marcus's fingers. Then he shook his head slowly. "Because some doors don't close easy once you open them." He turned and walked back toward the entrance, his footsteps echoing until they faded into silence. Marcus stood alone in the tunnel, his flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand. He looked back at the wall, at the small opening he'd created, at the shimmer of mineral dust that promised something extraordinary hidden in the darkness beyond. And for the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge, he felt something other than despair. He felt purpose, dangerous, uncertain, but undeniably real. That night, back in the cabin, Marcus couldn't sleep. He sat at his grandfather's table, the journal open in front of him, reading by the light of a kerosene lamp. He'd skipped ahead, looking for entries from 1975 and 76, the years before the sealing. And there, near the end of the journal, he found it. July 9th, 1975. Hit the eastern vein today. What we found, it's beyond anything I imagined, beyond anything anyone's imagined. Samuel wants to report it immediately. File the claims. Bring in investors. But I told him no. Not yet. This isn't just ore. This is something that could change everything. And change like that, it doesn't come without a price. Men will kill for this. Governments will take it. It'll destroy this town, destroy us. So I'm making a choice. I'm sealing it, hiding it, until the world is ready, or until someone I trust can handle it the right way. Marcus's hands shook as he turned the page. The next entry was dated 6 months later. Samuel's dead. They said it was an accident, a fall in the north shaft. But I know better, he told someone. He couldn't keep quiet. And now he's gone. I've finished the wall. No one will find it. Now. No one except whoever I choose to tell. And I haven't chosen anyone yet. Maybe I never will. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that danced across the cabin walls. Marcus closed the journal and stared out the window at the dark shape of the mountain rising against the stars. His grandfather had found something in that mine, something valuable enough to kill for, and he'd kept it secret for more than 40 years, waiting for someone he could trust. Now Marcus was that someone, whether he wanted to be or not. The next morning, he returned to the mine before the sun was fully up. The mountains were quiet, just the sound of wind through pine trees and the distant call of a hawk. He worked quickly, dismantling more of the wall, widening the opening until he could climb through. On the other side, the tunnel stretched into darkness, sloping gently downward. The walls continued to shimmer with that strange mineral dust, and the air smelled different here, sharper, almost metallic. He moved forward slowly, his flashlight revealing a passage that had clearly been worked by hand. The ceiling was reinforced with newer timber, the kind you didn't find in old mines. His grandfather had been back here, maintaining it, preparing it. For what? The tunnel ran for maybe 50 yards before opening into a larger chamber. Marcus stepped inside and stopped, his light barely penetrating the space. The room was massive, easily 40 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadow above, and covering every surface, every wall, every exposed vein of rock, was a mineral formation unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. It wasn't gold. It wasn't silver. It was something else entirely. The stone glowed faintly in the flashlight beam, a deep blue-green that seemed to pulse with its own internal light. Veins of it ran through the rock like frozen lightning, thick as his arm in places, branching and splitting into crystalline formations that jutted from the walls like the bones of some ancient creature. Marcus moved closer, barely breathing. He reached out and touched one of the formations. It was cool, smooth, and harder than granite. He pulled a small hammer from his belt and tapped it gently against the surface. The sound that rang out was pure and clear, like a bell, and it echoed through the chamber for several seconds before fading. He knew what this was. He'd read about it in books, seen pictures in geology journals, but he'd never believed he'd actually see it in person. Painite, or something like it. One of the rarest minerals on Earth. So rare that for decades, only a handful of specimens existed in the entire world. And here it was, an entire chamber of it. Tons of it, maybe hundreds of tons. The kind of discovery that didn't just change a life. It changed everything. Marcus stood in that glowing chamber for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. His mind couldn't process the scale of what he was seeing. This wasn't a small vein that could be quietly mined and sold. This was a geological phenomenon, a deposit so large, so pure, that it would rewrite mineralogy textbooks and attract attention from every mining company, university, and government agency on the planet. And his grandfather had known about it, had kept it secret. had died protecting it. The hum he'd heard the day before was louder here, resonating through the stone itself. It wasn't water. It was the mineral, vibrating at a frequency just barely audible, responding to pressure and temperature in ways Marcus didn't understand. He pulled out his phone to take pictures, then remembered there was no signal this deep. No one knew he was here. No one knew what he'd found. He was completely alone with a $300 million secret, maybe more. He took samples, carefully chipping small pieces from the formations and placing them in a canvas bag. Then he backed out of the chamber, climbed through the opening in the wall, and made his way back to the surface. The daylight felt harsh and too bright after the cool darkness of the mine. Marcus stood at the entrance, blinking, trying to adjust. That's when he saw the truck. It was parked next to his own, a black Silverado with tinted windows and out-of-state plates. Montana. A man leaned against the hood, arms crossed, watching him. Not Garrett this time. Someone younger, harder. "Morning," the man said, his voice flat. "Heard you've been spending a lot of time in that old mine." Marcus's hand tightened on the canvas bag. "Private property." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, we know. We also know. Your grandfather used to work for Summit Mining back in the 70s, before he went independent, before he disappeared into these mountains and stopped talking." "Who's we?" Marcus asked. "Let's just say interested parties. People who keep track of mineral rights and old claims. People who remember when this mine was producing. And people who are very curious about why a dying old man spent the last 40 years guarding an empty hole in the ground." The man pushed off from the truck and took a step forward. "So, here's the thing. Whatever you found in there, it's not yours. Not legally. Summit Mining still holds subsurface rights on this land. Your grandfather only owned the surface, which means anything below 12 feet belongs to someone else." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "That's not true. The deed your grandfather filed was incomplete." The man interrupted. "He knew it. We knew it. But back then, nobody cared, because the mine was tapped out. Now though, if something valuable turned up, well, that changes the conversation." The man pulled a business card from his pocket and held it out. "Name's Cole. I represent Summit's legal interests. Give me a call when you're ready to talk terms. Because trust me, you don't want this to get ugly." Marcus didn't take the card. He just stared at the man until Cole shrugged, dropped it on the ground, and climbed back into his truck. The Silverado rumbled to life and rolled back down the access road, kicking up dust. Marcus stood there until the sound of the engine faded completely. Then he bent down, picked up the card, and read it. Cole Hendricks, Acquisitions and Claims Management, Summit Mining Corporation, an office address in Denver, a phone number, and at the bottom, in small print, "Securing America's mineral future since 1952. He crumpled the card in his fist. His grandfather hadn't been paranoid. He'd been right. The moment word got out about what was in that mine, people would come. Lawyers, corporations, maybe worse. They'd use every tool they had to take it. Legal claims, intimidation, force if necessary. And Marcus, a broke construction worker with no resources and no allies, wouldn't stand a chance. Unless he fought smarter. He walked back to the cabin, his mind racing. Inside, he spread out every document he could find. The property deed, his grandfather's mining permits, old survey maps, tax records, claim filings going back to the 1950s. He read through everything twice, looking for loopholes, protections, anything that would prove his grandfather's ownership was legitimate and complete. And then he found it. Buried in a folder marked Estate Documents was a legal filing from 1976, a subsurface rights reclamation petition. His grandfather had filed it with the county, arguing that Summit Mining had abandoned their claim by failing to work the mine for more than 5 consecutive years. Under Colorado law, abandoned subsurface rights reverted to the surface owner. The petition had been approved, signed by a judge, stamped and notarized. Vincent Brennan had owned everything, surface and subsurface, since 1976, which meant Coal and Summit Mining were lying. They had no legal claim, but they were betting Marcus wouldn't know that, or wouldn't be able to prove it. He grabbed the document and his truck keys. There was one person in Copper Ridge who might be able to help him. He just hoped she'd be willing. Her name was Elena, and she ran the county assessor's office out of a cramped room in the back of the town hall. She was maybe 50, with sharp eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent decades dealing with property disputes and bad paperwork. Marcus had met her briefly when he'd first registered the inheritance. Now he stood in her doorway, holding the reclamation petition, trying not to look as desperate as he felt. "I need to know if this is real," he said. Elena looked up from her computer, saw what he was holding, and her expression shifted. "Where did you find that?" "My grandfather's files." She motioned for him to come in and close the door. He did. She took the document, examined it closely, checked the stamps and signatures, then pulled up something on her computer. For several minutes, the only sound was the clicking of keys, the hum of an old desktop fan. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. "It's real," she said, "and it's legal. Your grandfather filed this correctly, followed every procedure. As of 1976, he owned all rights to that property, surface and subsurface." Marcus felt a wave of relief, so intense it almost knocked him over. "So, if someone claims they have subsurface rights, they're lying," Elena said flatly, "or mistaken. But given how thorough your grandfather was, I'm guessing it's the former." She looked at him carefully. "Who's been asking?" Marcus told her about Coal, about Summit Mining, about the threats disguised as friendly warnings. Elena's expression darkened. "They tried this before," she said, "back in the 80s. Sent lawyers up here claiming they had rights to half the mines in the county. Most of the small operators couldn't afford to fight, so they settled for pennies. But your grandfather didn't. He went to court, represented himself, and won. Cost Summit a fortune in legal fees, and made them look like fools." She handed the document back. "Whatever's in that mine, Marcus, it's yours. But you need to file a protective claim with the state. Today, because if Summit thinks there's something valuable up there, they won't stop at legal tricks. They'll escalate." Marcus nodded slowly. "What do I need to do?" Elena pulled out a form and started filling it in. "First, we document the existing claim. Then we file an intent to operate. That puts it on record that the mine is active and under your control. It won't stop them, but it'll make it harder for them to argue abandonment or adverse possession." She paused. "But Marcus, if what they're after is as big as I think it is, you need more than paperwork. You need a lawyer. A good one." "I can't afford a lawyer," Marcus said quietly. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a business card. "This is my daughter. She's an attorney in Boulder, specializes in mineral rights and environmental law. Tell her I sent you. She'll take the case pro bono if I ask her to." Marcus took the card, feeling something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope, maybe, or just the faint possibility that he wasn't completely alone in this. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Elena's expression softened. "Because your grandfather helped me once. 20 years ago, my husband died in a mining accident. The company tried to say it was his fault, that he'd been negligent. Your grandfather testified on my behalf, told the truth even though it cost him contracts and friendships. We won the case because of him." She stood up. "Vincent Brennan was a good man, and he trusted you with something important. So I'm going to help you protect it." Marcus left the town hall with the filed paperwork, the lawyer's card, and the first flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, he could win this. But as he climbed into his truck, he saw movement in his rear-view mirror. The black Silverado was back, parked across the street. Cole sat behind the wheel, watching, not hiding, just making sure Marcus knew he was there. The message was clear. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Marcus started the engine, pulled out onto the main road, and drove back up into the mountains. The mine entrance waited in shadow, the chain hanging loose where he'd left it. He stood at the threshold, looking into the darkness, and thought about his grandfather. About a man who'd spent 40 years protecting a secret because he believed it was too dangerous to unleash, without the right person to guide it. Vincent had chosen him, a broke, desperate, struggling mountain man, with nothing left to lose. And maybe that was exactly the point. Maybe the only person who could be trusted with something this valuable was someone who understood that not everything precious should be sold. Some things were worth fighting for. Some legacies were bigger than money. Marcus picked up the chain, locked it back in place, and pocketed the key. Then he turned and looked out over the valley below, where Copper Ridge sat quiet in the afternoon light. Somewhere down there, people were making plans, lawyers were drafting documents, corporations were calculating value. But up here, in the thin mountain air, with the weight of his grandfather's trust on his shoulders, Marcus made a different kind of calculation. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to sell. He was going to fight. For the mine, for the legacy, for the chance to prove that sometimes the most valuable thing a man can inherit isn't what's buried in the ground. It's the courage to stand up and say, "This is mine, and I'm not giving it up." Marcus spent the next 3 days preparing. He wasn't just going back into that mine to look around. He was going in to document everything, to understand exactly what his grandfather had been protecting, and to build a case so airtight that no corporation or lawyer could take it from him. He bought supplies from Dale's store with the last of his cash. Heavy-duty work lights, extension cords, powered by a portable generator, a digital camera, sample bags, a geology hammer, safety equipment, and notebooks. Dale watched him load everything into the truck bed without comment, but his expression said plenty. Finally, as Marcus was securing the last of the gear, Dale spoke. "Your grandfather used to come in here once a month," he said quietly. "Always bought the same things. Timber supports, rock bolts, ventilation equipment. Said he was just maintaining the structure, keeping it safe." He paused. "But maintenance don't usually require a man to haul out 5 tons of equipment over 40 years. Marcus looked up. "You think he was working it?" "I think," Dale said carefully, "that Vincent Brennan was the smartest man I ever met, and smart men don't waste 4 decades guarding nothing." That evening, Marcus called Elena's daughter. Her name was Sarah, and she listened without interrupting as he explained everything. The mine, the discovery, Summit Mining's threats, the reclamation documents. When he finished, there was a long silence on the line. "I'll take the case," Sarah said finally. "But Marcus, you need to understand what you're up against. Summit Mining has resources we don't. They'll drag this out, file motion after motion, try to bleed you dry financially and emotionally. The only way we win is if what you found is significant enough that public pressure forces them to back down." "It's significant," Marcus said. "How significant?" He thought about that glowing chamber, those massive formations pulsing with their own light. $300 million significant. Maybe more. Sarah was quiet again. Then, "I'm driving up tomorrow. Don't go back in that mine until I get there. We need to document this properly." But Marcus couldn't wait. The next morning, before the sun cleared the peaks, he was back at the mine entrance with his equipment. He set up the generator, ran the lights, and descended into the darkness. This time, he went deeper, past the sealed chamber he'd already discovered, following a passage his grandfather's journal had mentioned. but never fully described. The tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, the air growing cooler and drier with each step. His work lights cast harsh shadows on the walls, revealing something he'd missed before. Marks. Hundreds of them. Small scratches carved into the stone at regular intervals, like someone had been counting years, maybe, or visits, or promises kept. Every 50 feet, Marcus found evidence of his grandfather's work. Fresh timber supports, some dated as recently as last year. Ventilation shafts drilled through to the surface, allowing air circulation. Emergency supply caches, water, first aid kits, batteries. This wasn't the work of a man maintaining an abandoned mine. This was the work of a man preparing for something. Preparing for someone. The tunnel branched twice, both times marked with his grandfather's handwriting on the wall. North, unstable, do not enter. South, survey only, no extraction. But there was a third branch, unmarked except for a single word carved deep into the stone. Truth. Marcus followed it. The passage narrowed here, forcing him to duck in places, the walls pressing close. His light caught something ahead, another barrier, but not like the first. This one was more sophisticated. Steel reinforcement beams had been set into the rock, and heavy wooden planks had been fitted between them, creating a wall that looked less like a mine seal and more like a vault door. And in the center, at chest height, was a lock. Not a padlock, a combination lock, the kind you'd find on a safe. 4 digits. Marcus stood there, his light playing across the mechanism, and felt his heart sink. 4 digits meant 10,000 possible combinations. He could spend weeks trying random numbers and never find it, unless. He pulled out his grandfather's journal and flipped through it by flashlight, looking for anything that might be a clue. Dates, numbers, measurements. There were hundreds of them. Then he saw it, written in the margin of the final entry. The day I understood what mattered. 7/23/56. July 23rd, 1956. Marcus did the math quickly. That would have made his grandfather 20 years old. Young. Just starting out. He turned to the lock and carefully dialed. 7, 2, 3, 5, 6. Nothing. He tried again, this time thinking like someone who'd spent decades protecting a secret. 7:23. Then 56. Still, nothing. Then he remembered something his father had told him once, years ago. A story about Vincent enlisting in the army, serving 2 years, coming home, changed. Coming home on July 23rd, 1956, the day his real life began. Marcus tried one more combination. 5, 6, 7, 23. The lock clicked. The mechanism turned. The steel reinforcement groaned as the wooden planks swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing not a tunnel this time, but stairs. Carved stone steps, descending into darkness so complete his light barely touched it. Marcus hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to wait for Sarah, to document this properly, to not go forward alone. But something deeper, something that felt like his grandfather's hand on his shoulder, urged him on. He descended. The stairs went down 30 feet, maybe 40, spiraling in a slow curve that made him dizzy. At the bottom, the space opened into something that took his breath away. It wasn't a chamber. It was a cathedral. The ceiling soared overhead, easily 60 feet high, supported by natural stone columns that looked like they'd been shaped by ancient water flow. The walls curved inward and upward, forming a dome that would have made architects weep, and covering every surface, every wall, every column, every inch, stone, was the mineral. But here, it wasn't just veins or formations. It was massive. Crystalline structures, the size of cars, jutted from the floor. Sheets of it covered the walls like frozen waterfalls. And in the center of the space, rising from floor to ceiling, was a column of pure mineral, maybe 15 feet in diameter, glowing with that same eerie blue-green light. Marcus moved forward in a daze, his light no longer necessary. The mineral itself provided illumination, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. He reached out and touched the central column. It was warm, not hot, just pleasantly warm, like sun-heated stone. And the hum he'd heard before was overwhelming here, resonating through his bones, filling his head with a sound that was almost music. He pulled out his camera and started taking pictures, though he knew no photograph could capture this. The scale was too massive, the light too strange. This was something you had to see to believe. And even then, belief was difficult. He spent an hour documenting everything, taking samples, measuring dimensions, trying to wrap his mind around what he was seeing. The formations in the first chamber had been impressive. This was beyond impressive. This was geological legend. This was the kind of discovery that happened once in a century, once in a lifetime. Never. And then he found the placard. It was mounted on a steel stand near the base of the central column, protected by a clear case. Inside was a handwritten letter, on paper yellowed with age. Marcus opened the case carefully and lifted out the letter. The handwriting was his grandfather's, but younger, less steady. Dated July 24, 1975. To whoever finds this, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've managed to get past every barrier I put in place, which means you're either very determined or very lucky. Probably both. What you're standing in front of is the largest known deposit of high-grade painite on Earth. Maybe in the form, solar system. We don't know yet. Samuel and I discovered it by accident when we were following what we thought was a silver vein. Instead, we found this. We brought in a geologist friend, someone we trusted. He took samples, ran tests, and came back white as a sheet. Said what we'd found was worth more than most countries' GDP. Said it was so rare, so pure, that universities would fight over it. Mining companies would go to war. Governments would claim national interest. And he was right, because word got out. We don't know how, but it did. Within a month, we had strangers asking questions, investors showing up uninvited, lawyers serving papers, and then Samuel died. They said it was an accident. I know it wasn't. So I made a choice. I sealed this place, hid it, spent the next 40 years making sure no one could find it until I knew the world was ready, or until someone I trusted could handle it the right way. I never married, never had children, kept people at a distance, because I knew if I got close to anyone, they'd be in danger. This secret is a burden, but it's also a gift. Not just the wealth, though, that's here. The gift is the choice. You can sell this to the highest bidder and walk away rich. You can donate it to science and let researchers study it. You can keep it hidden and protect it like I did. Or you can find a fourth option, something I never thought of. But whatever you choose, remember this. Some things are more valuable than money. Legacy matters, honor matters, and the way you handle power says more about who you are than anything else in life. I hope I chose the right person to find this. I hope you prove me right. Vincent Brennan. Marcus read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. Then he carefully placed it back in the case and stood in the center of that glowing cathedral, surrounded by $300 million worth of mineral deposit, and felt the weight of his grandfather's trust settle onto his shoulders like a physical ennui. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a test, a question his grandfather had been asking for 40 years. What kind of man are you? Marcus climbed back to the surface as the sun was setting, his mind spinning with everything he'd seen. He emerged from the mine entrance, covered in dust and glowing mineral powder that made him look like he'd been touched by something otherworldly. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the car parked next to his truck until a door slammed. He looked up to see Sarah stepping out, a leather briefcase in one hand and an expression that was equal parts annoyed and impressed. "You couldn't wait 12 hours?" she said. Marcus shrugged, too tired and overwhelmed to defend himself. "I had to see it." "And?" Sarah asked, her lawyer's instincts already assessing, calculating. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Marcus pulled a sample from his pocket, one of the smaller pieces he'd chipped from the cathedral chamber. Even in the fading daylight, it glowed faintly, pulsing with that strange internal luminescence. He handed it to Sarah. She held it up to the light, her eyes widening. "What is this?" "Painite," Marcus said. "Or something like it. There's an entire cathedral of it down there. Tons of it. My grandfather spent 40 years hiding it." Sarah's professional composure cracked slightly. "Jesus, Marcus, do you have any idea what this means? That I'm in a lot of trouble? That you're sitting on the biggest mineral find since the Cullinan diamond? Maybe bigger." She carefully placed the sample in her briefcase. "We need to move fast. If Summit Mining gets even a hint of this, they'll escalate beyond legal threats. We're talking about corporate espionage, sabotage, maybe worse." "My grandfather mentioned that," Marcus said quietly. "His partner died right after they found it. 40 years ago." Sarah's expression hardened. "Then we document everything, file every protection we can think of, and prepare for war. Because that's what this is going to be." They worked late into the night at the cabin. Sarah's laptop open on the table. Forms and filings spread across every surface. Marcus told her everything. The journal entries, the sealed chambers, the combination lock, the letter his grandfather had left. Sarah listened, took notes, and built a strategy. "First, we file an updated mining claim with the state," she said, typing rapidly. "Then, we file a protective order preventing any third party from entering the property. Then we contact the U.S. Geological Survey and offer them limited access for scientific documentation. That creates a paper trail showing you're acting in good faith and protecting the find for research purposes, not just profit." "Will that stop Summit?" Marcus asked. "No," Sarah admitted. "But it'll make it harder for them to paint you as some rogue operator trying to hide assets. We need public opinion on our side." She looked up at him. "And Marcus, you need to decide what you actually want to do with this. Because once we go public, once the world knows, there's no going back. Your life will never be private again. What happens next will turn this discovery into a battle that threatens everything Marcus holds dear. Expose secrets that powerful men have killed to protect and force him to choose between wealth and legacy. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more." Marcus stared out the cabin window at the dark shape of the mountain. "My grandfather chose to hide it," he said slowly. "He gave up 40 years of his life to protect it. Why would I do anything different?" "Because," Sarah said gently, "times have changed. The world has changed. What was dangerous in 1975 might be manageable now. And besides, you're not your grandfather. You're allowed to make different choices." Marcus thought about that. About the placard. About his grandfather's letter. About the question underneath it all. "What kind of man are you?" "I don't want to sell it," he said finally. "Not to a corporation, not to the highest bidder. But I don't want to hide it either. That deposit, it could fund research, education, infrastructure. It could help people." Sarah smiled. "Then that's what we'll propose. A trust, community-controlled, with you as the steward. The wealth gets used for public good, and you maintain control over the extraction and distribution. Will that work?" "It'll make you a lot of enemies," Sarah said. "But yes, it could work." They filed the paperwork at dawn, submitting claims and proposals to every relevant state and federal agency. By noon, Sarah had contacted 3 major geology departments, offering them exclusive research access in exchange for public documentation of the find. By evening, The first news article appeared online. Massive rare earth mineral deposit discovered in Colorado mountains. The article was vague on details, but it included Marcus's name and the location of the mine. Within an hour, his phone started ringing. Reporters, mining companies, investment firms, even a representative from the Smithsonian. Marcus ignored them all, but he couldn't ignore the black Silverado that rolled up the access road just after dark. This time, Cole didn't come alone. 3 other men climbed out of the truck, all wearing suits that looked wrong in the mountain wilderness, all carrying briefcases that probably held legal threats disguised as offers. Marcus met them at the cabin door, Sarah standing behind him. "Mr. Brennan," Cole said, his voice professionally pleasant, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. My associates and I would like to discuss a partnership opportunity." "Not interested," Marcus said. "You haven't heard the offer. Don't need to. The mine's not for sale." One of the other men stepped forward, older, with silver hair, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Richard Sutton, Chief Legal Counsel for Summit Mining. I understand you've filed some rather ambitious claims with the state. Claims that, frankly, overreach your legal authority." "My authority is solid," Sarah interjected. "We have documentation proving—" "Documentation that's 40 years old," Sutton interrupted smoothly. "Based on laws that have since been revised. Based on claims that were never properly contested because everyone assumed the mine was worthless. But now that it's not worthless, those assumptions need to be revisited." He smiled, cold and calculated. "We're prepared to offer you $12 million for a full transfer of property rights. That's significantly more than the land is worth, and it allows you to walk away from what's about to become a very complicated legal situation." "$12 million, Marcus repeated, "for a deposit worth $300 million. Sutton's smile didn't waver. "Alleged deposit. You have samples, but you don't have independent verification. You don't have extraction feasibility studies. You don't have environmental impact assessments, all of which will take years and cost millions you don't have." He leaned in slightly. "Or you can take our offer, cash out, and let professionals handle the complicated parts." Marcus felt Sarah tense beside him. He knew she wanted to argue, to fight back with legal precedents and procedural requirements. But he also knew Sutton was right about one thing. This was going to get complicated, expensive, exhausting. It would be so much easier to take the money and walk away. Let someone else deal with the burden his grandfather had carried for 4 decades. But then he remembered the letter. The question, "What kind of man are you?" "No," Marcus said simply. Sutton's smile finally faded. "That's a mistake." "Maybe," Marcus acknowledged, "but it's my mistake to make." The 4 men exchanged glances. Then Sutton reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick document. "Then, consider this your official notice. Summit Mining Corporation is filing suit to halt all operations on this property, pending resolution of subsurface rights claims. You're also being served with an injunction preventing you from removing, selling, or distributing any materials from the mine until ownership is legally established." He dropped the document on the porch. "You have 30 days to respond. After that, we take possession pending trial. And trust me, Mr. Brennan, we can afford to tie this up in court for the next decade. Can you?" They left without waiting for an answer, the Silverado's tail lights disappearing down the mountain road. Marcus picked up the document and handed it to Sarah. She flipped through it, her expression growing darker with each page. "They're not bluffing," she said quietly. "This is aggressive. They're coming at you from 6 different legal angles, and they're asking for emergency injunctions on all of them. Can we fight it? We can try. But Marcus, they're right about one thing. This is going to cost money you don't have. Legal fees alone could run into hundreds of thousands." She looked up at him. "Unless what?" Marcus asked. "Unless we find a way to fund your legal defense with the very thing they're trying to take. If we can get even partial extraction rights approved, even on a limited basis, we could sell enough samples to cover costs and prove value. She started pacing, her lawyer's mind working through scenarios. But that requires state approval, environmental clearances, independent verification, all of which takes time. How much time? 6 months. Maybe more. Marcus thought about that. 6 months of legal battles, while Summit Mining used every delay, tactic, and procedural roadblock they could find. 6 months of watching his inheritance slip away. 6 months of wondering if his grandfather's 40 years of protection had been for nothing. He looked out at the mountain, at the dark entrance to the mine, visible through the trees. Then we'd better get started, he said. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in his grandfather's narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl through the pines outside. Somewhere in the darkness, Summit Mining was planning its next move. Lawyers were drafting motions. Executives were calculating profits. And he was just one man, with a secret too big to protect and too important to surrender. He thought about his grandfather, alone in these mountains for 40 years. How many nights had Vincent lain awake, carrying this burden? How many times had he been tempted to give up, to cash out, to let someone else take responsibility? And how had he found the strength to keep going? Marcus got up and walked to the window. The stars were bright and sharp in the thin mountain air, the kind of sky you only get far from cities and complications. He pressed his palm against the cold glass and closed his eyes. "I hope I'm doing this right," he whispered to the ghost of a man he barely remembered. "I hope you chose the right person." The wind answered, whistling through the cracks in the old cabin. And somewhere in that sound, Marcus thought he heard something that might have been approval. Or maybe just the mountain, indifferent and eternal, waiting to see what kind of man he'd prove to be. The next morning, everything changed. Marcus woke to the sound of vehicles. Not just one or two, but dozens. He stumbled to the window and felt his heart drop. The access road was lined with trucks, news vans with satellite dishes, SUVs with corporate logos, government vehicles with official plates. And at the front of the convoy, directing traffic like he owned the place, stood Cole. They'd leaked the story. Summit Mining had gone public with the discovery, spinning it as a dangerous situation where an inexperienced operator was sitting on a potentially hazardous mineral deposit, without proper safety protocols or oversight. They were painting Marcus as reckless, as a threat to public safety, as someone who needed to be stopped for his own good and everyone else's. Sarah's truck skidded to a stop in the driveway, and she jumped out, phone pressed to her ear, her expression furious. "They moved faster than I expected," she said, hanging up. "They've already got a judge hearing their emergency injunction request this afternoon. We need to be there." "How did they?" Marcus started. "They have resources." Sarah cut him off. "Money, connections, influence, and they're using all of it." She grabbed his arm. "Marcus, this is about to become very public, very fast. Are you ready for that?" Marcus looked at the crowd gathering at the edge of his property. Reporters setting up cameras, lawyers conferring in tight groups, curiosity seekers taking pictures with their phones. His private inheritance, his grandfather's carefully guarded secret, was about to become the biggest story in Colorado. Maybe bigger. "No," he admitted, "but I don't think I have a choice anymore." Sarah squeezed his arm. "Then let's go to court and fight. Because if we don't show up, if we don't contest this, they win by default." They drove to the county courthouse in Boulder, Sarah's truck trailing a convoy of news vehicles that followed like sharks scenting blood. Inside the courthouse, the hallway outside the courtroom was packed. Marcus recognized some faces from town. Elena from the assessor's office, Dale from the gas station, even Garrett, his grandfather's old partner, standing in the back, with his arms crossed. And there, surrounded by a phalanx of expensive lawyers, stood Richard Sutton, looking confident and calm. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Summit's lawyers argued that Marcus lacked the expertise, resources, and legal authority to manage a discovery of this magnitude. They presented documentation suggesting environmental hazards, structural instability, and public safety concerns. They argued that immediate, injunctive relief was necessary to prevent irreparable harm. Sarah countered with Vincent's meticulous documentation, 40 years of safety maintenance logs, environmental reports, and the legal reclamation petition that proved clear ownership. She argued that Summit's claims were manufactured to create a false sense of urgency, and that their real motivation was pure profit. The judge, an older woman named Delacroix, listened to both sides without expression. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "Mr. Brennan," she said, looking directly at Marcus, "why are you fighting this? You've been offered significant compensation. You could walk away a wealthy man and let the courts sort out the complicated parts. Why put yourself through this?" Marcus stood, his legs shaking slightly. He wasn't prepared for this. Wasn't prepared to speak in front of dozens of people, lawyers, reporters, cameras. But Sarah nodded at him encouragingly, and he found his voice. "Because my grandfather spent 40 years protecting this discovery," Marcus said. "Not because he was greedy or scared, but because he believed some things are more important than profit. He believed this deposit could benefit people, communities, science, not just shareholders." He took a breath. "I'm not an expert. I don't have resources. But I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to work with researchers, with environmental groups, with anyone who wants to see this handled responsibly. I'm not asking to get rich. I'm asking for the chance to honor my grandfather's legacy and do this right." The courtroom was silent. Judge Delacroix studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke. "I'm denying the emergency injunction," she said. "Mr. Brennan has demonstrated sufficient evidence of legal ownership and responsible stewardship. However," she held up a hand as Summit's lawyers started to object, "I'm ordering an independent geological survey to verify the deposit's composition and value. I'm also requiring Mr. Brennan to submit a comprehensive safety and environmental plan within 90 days. If either of these requirements is not met, we'll revisit this matter." She banged her gavel. Court adjourned. Marcus felt Sarah grab his arm in triumph, but he barely registered it, because he was watching Sutton's face. And the expression there wasn't defeat. It was something darker, something that promised this was far from over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Marcus pushed through them without comment, Sarah running interference, until they reached the truck. They were almost to the parking lot exit when Marcus saw him. Garrett, leaning against a rusted pickup, waiting. Marcus told Sarah he'd be right back and walked over. "Congratulations," Garrett said, though his tone was flat. "You just painted a target on your back." "You worked with my grandfather," Marcus said. "Tell me what happened. Tell me why Samuel really died." Garrett was quiet for a long time, his weathered face unreadable. Then he sighed. "Because he believed people were good. He believed if you showed them something beautiful, something rare, they'd appreciate it. Protect it." He met Marcus's eyes. But Summit didn't want to protect it. They wanted to own it. And when Samuel wouldn't sell, when he wouldn't back down, they made an example of him. "How?" Marcus demanded. "How did they?" "I don't know the details," Garrett interrupted. "Your grandfather never told me. But I know Samuel went into that mine to get more samples. Went to prove the deposit was real, so he could secure independent funding. And he never came out. They said it was a structural collapse, that the tunnel was unstable. But Vincent didn't believe it. He sealed everything up that same week and never let anyone close again." Garrett pushed off from the truck. "You won today. Enjoy it. Because tomorrow, Summit's going to come at you harder. And they don't care about courts or laws or what's right. They care about profit. And they'll do whatever it takes." He climbed into his truck and drove away. leaving Marcus standing in the parking lot with a hollow feeling in his chest. Sarah walked up beside him. "You okay?" "No," Marcus admitted, "but I don't think I'm supposed to be." The week after the hearing, Marcus's life became unrecognizable. News crews camped at the base of the access road. Telephoto lenses pointed at the cabin like rifles. His phone rang constantly with numbers he didn't recognize. Investors, mining consultants, documentary filmmakers, even a producer from Hollywood who wanted to option his story. He stopped answering. Sarah had warned him this would happen, but warning and experiencing were different animals. Every time he drove into town for supplies, people stared, some with admiration, most with suspicion. Money changed things. The promise of money changed them faster. At Ruth's diner, where he'd grabbed breakfast his first week in Copper Ridge, the owner refused to serve him. "You're bringing trouble to this town," she'd said, arms crossed, face hard. Summit Mining employed half the men here back in the 80s. "You win this fight, you think they'll just walk away? They'll close operations. People will lose jobs, all because you're too stubborn to take a payout." Marcus had left without arguing. What could he say? She wasn't entirely wrong. This fight was bigger than just him and his inheritance. It had roots that went back decades, tangled in the economic survival of an entire community. But giving in felt like betraying his grandfather's 40 years of sacrifice. And that was something Marcus couldn't live with. The independent geological survey took 2 weeks to complete. A team of 3 researchers from the Colorado School of Mines spent 12-hour days in the mine, taking samples, running tests, documenting everything. Marcus accompanied them, partly because the court order required it, partly because he wanted to understand what he was really sitting on. The lead researcher, Dr. Patricia Chen, was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an intensity that reminded Marcus of his grandfather. She didn't make small talk, didn't waste time, just worked with a precision that bordered on reverence. On the final day, as they were packing up equipment, Marcus asked her what she'd found. "Doctor." Chen looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "In 30 years of field work, I've seen a lot of rare mineral deposits. Samples that make collectors weep, formations that end up in museums." She paused. "I've never seen anything like what's in that cathedral chamber. The purity alone defies explanation. The size of the crystalline structures suggests formation over millions of years under conditions we don't fully understand. And the luminescence, that glow you described, that's caused by trace elements we're still trying to identify." "What's it worth?" Marcus asked quietly. "Conservatively, 300 million. But if the market for rare earth minerals continues growing, if technological applications expand, if even half of what's down there can be extracted without compromising the formation's integrity." She shook her head. "You're looking at potentially $1 billion deposit, maybe more." Marcus felt the ground tilt beneath him. $1 billion. The number was too big to process, too abstract to feel real. Dr. Chen must have seen something in his face, because her expression softened. "Your grandfather did the right thing by sealing this," she said. "In the 70s, the technology didn't exist to extract this responsibly. It would have been destroyed, torn apart by companies that only saw profit. But now, with modern techniques, precision extraction, laser mapping, we could harvest portions while preserving the larger formation, turn it into a living research site, a natural monument." She handed him her card. "When you're ready, when this legal mess is sorted out, call me. I'd like to be part of whatever you decide to do with this." That evening, Sarah came to the cabin with news. "The survey results are being filed with the court tomorrow," she said, spreading papers across the table. "Which means Summit will see them. And when they do, they're going to escalate." "How much worse can it get?" Marcus asked. Sarah's expression was grim. "They've already filed 3 additional motions. 1, challenging the validity of your grandfather's reclamation petition. 1, demanding an audit of all mine maintenance expenses, to prove continuous operation, and one requesting the court appoint a neutral third party to manage the property until ownership is fully resolved. Can they do that? They can try. And with enough money and enough lawyers, they can drag this out for years. She sat down heavily. Marcus, I need to be honest with you. My firm can't carry this pro bono much longer. We're already $10,000 deep in research and filing fees. If this goes to trial, if it drags into appeals, we're looking at costs that could exceed $500,000. Marcus felt his stomach drop. I don't have that kind of money. I know, Sarah said gently, which is why we need to consider alternatives. There are litigation funding companies that specialize in cases like this. They cover legal costs in exchange for a percentage of any settlement or judgment, usually around 30 to 40%. So I'd be giving up almost half, Marcus said, to fight for what's already mine. Or, Sarah said carefully, we could approach this differently. What if instead of fighting Summit, we negotiated, not a full sale, but a partnership? They provide resources and expertise. You maintain control and ownership. They get a percentage of profits. You get to honor your grandfather's vision and keep the land. It made sense. Logically, strategically, it was probably the smartest move. But something about it felt wrong. Felt like compromise in the worst way. Like letting the people who'd threatened him, who'd possibly killed Samuel, who'd spent decades trying to steal this deposit, win anyway. Before Marcus could respond, headlights swept across the cabin windows. A vehicle was coming up the access road, moving fast. Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. It was past 10 at night. No one came up here this late. Marcus grabbed the shotgun his grandfather had kept above the door, checked that it was loaded, and stepped onto the porch. Sarah followed, her phone already dialed to 911, thumb hovering over the call button. The vehicle that pulled up wasn't the black Silverado. It was a dusty Jeep Wrangler with local plates. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back in a braid, and the kind of weathered face that came from decades in the sun. Marcus had never seen her before. Marcus Brennan, she called out. Who's asking? My name's Helen Carver. I need to talk to you about your grandfather and what really happened in 1975. Marcus didn't lower the shotgun. I don't know you. No, you don't, Helen agreed. But I knew Vincent. And I knew Samuel. I was there the day they found the deposit. I was the geologist they brought in to verify it. She took a step closer, hands visible, non-threatening. And I'm the one who told them what they'd discovered, which means I'm partly responsible for Samuel's death and your grandfather's 40 years of isolation. I owe you the truth. Marcus looked at Sarah, who nodded slightly. He lowered the shotgun and gestured to the cabin. Then, you'd better come inside. Helen sat at the kitchen table, accepted the coffee Marcus offered, and wrapped her hands around the mug like she was cold despite the warmth of the wood stove. For a long moment, she just stared into the dark liquid. Then, she began to speak. I was 32 years old in 1975, fresh out of graduate school, one of maybe a dozen women in my field, trying to build a career in an industry that didn't want me. Vincent and Samuel hired me because I was cheap, desperate, and wouldn't ask too many questions. They'd found something in their mine, something they couldn't identify, and they needed expert analysis. She smiled faintly. I thought it would be routine. Test some samples, write a report, collect my fee. But the moment I saw what they'd pulled out of that mountain, I knew it wasn't routine. It was historic. Helen described that first visit to the mine, climbing down into the cathedral chamber with Vincent and Samuel, both of them excited and nervous, showing her the formations like proud fathers. She'd taken samples, run every test she could think of, and spent 3 days locked in her lab trying to convince herself the results were wrong. But they weren't wrong, she continued. What they'd found was the purest, most extensive painite deposit ever documented. At the time, the entire world supply of painite consisted of maybe 24 individual crystals, most smaller than your fingernail, and here were tons of it. Room-sized formations. It was like discovering a mountain made of diamonds. She paused, her expression darkening. I did what I thought was right. I documented everything properly, followed scientific protocols, prepared a comprehensive report, and I submitted it to the Geological Society for peer review, because discoveries like this needed to be verified by the scientific community. You went public, Marcus said. Not exactly public, Helen corrected. But I went through channels, official channels, which meant the report passed through multiple hands before it reached the peer reviewers. And somewhere along that chain, someone leaked it. She looked at Marcus directly. Within 2 weeks, Vincent and Samuel were being contacted by mining companies, investment groups, government agencies. Everyone wanted a piece of it. Some made legitimate offers, others made threats. And then, Summit Mining showed up. Helen described how Summit had approached them with what seemed like a reasonable proposal. A partnership where Vincent and Samuel would maintain ownership, while Summit provided extraction, expertise, and equipment. They'd signed preliminary agreements, started planning extraction operations. Everything seemed legitimate, until Samuel started asking questions. He noticed discrepancies in the financial projections, Helen said. Numbers that didn't add up. Contract language that seemed designed to gradually transfer ownership away from him and Vincent. He confronted Summit's representatives, demanded clarification, and they told him to trust the process, to not worry about details. She took a shaky breath. Samuel wasn't the type to ignore details. He started digging, researching Summit's history, talking to other small operators they'd partnered with, and he discovered a pattern. Summit would partner with independent miners, gradually assume more control through complex financial arrangements, then force buyouts when the operators couldn't meet inflated cost obligations. It was legal theft, dressed up as legitimate business. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, so Samuel tried to back out. He tried to cancel the partnership agreement, Helen confirmed. But Summit claimed they'd already invested significant resources based on preliminary contracts. They threatened legal action, demanded compensation for expenses. It got ugly fast. She looked down at her coffee. The day before Samuel died, he called me, said he was going into the mine to document everything one more time, wanted fresh samples, updated measurements, proof that could help their legal case. I told him to wait, to let me come with him. But he said he couldn't wait, said Vincent was getting threats, said he needed to move fast. Her voice cracked slightly. They found his body 2 days later. Summit's investigators ruled it an accidental cave-in, structural instability in an unmapped tunnel. But Vincent never believed it. He went into that mine the day after Samuel's funeral and found evidence that the collapse wasn't natural. What kind of evidence? Sarah asked, leaning forward. Blast residue, Helen said. Small charges, placed to trigger a localized collapse. Not enough to bring down the whole tunnel, just enough to trap someone in the wrong place at the wrong time. Vincent took samples, tried to report it to the authorities, but Summit had connections. The sheriff at the time was on their payroll, or close enough. The investigation was closed. Accidental death. Case settled. She looked at Marcus with eyes that carried 40 years of guilt. Your grandfather sealed the mine the next week, told me to destroy my research, to never speak about the discovery again. And I did. Because I was scared. Because Samuel was dead, and Vincent was right that this deposit was too dangerous in the wrong hands. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. But I kept copies of everything. My original report, test results, documentation of Summit's partnership proposals, everything. I've carried it around for decades, waiting. I didn't know who I was waiting for until I saw your name in the news. She slid the envelope across the table. This is proof that Summit knew about the deposit 40 years ago, that they tried to steal it then, that they have a history of aggressive acquisition tactics, and that your grandfather had every reason to fear them. Marcus opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were yellowed documents, faded photographs, test results, and correspondence. Evidence that transformed his legal battle from a property dispute into something much darker. Sarah was already reading through the documents, her lawyer's instincts cataloging every piece. "This changes everything," she said. "This proves Summit has been after this mine for decades. This proves they have a pattern of predatory practices. If we can get this admitted as evidence, they'll fight it," Helen interrupted. "They'll claim the documents are unreliable, that I'm biased, that it's ancient history. They have armies of lawyers whose only job is to make inconvenient truths disappear. But it gives us leverage," Sarah insisted. "It makes them vulnerable. If this goes public, if the media gets hold of a story connecting Summit Mining to a 40-year-old suspicious death," she looked at Marcus, "they might be willing to negotiate." "Really negotiate this time?" Marcus stared at the envelope, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on him. His grandfather had carried this burden alone, had sacrificed everything to protect a secret that powerful men wanted buried. And now that burden was his. But he wasn't alone. Not anymore. Over the next week, things moved quickly. Sarah used Helen's documentation to file an amended response to Summit's motions, including allegations of bad faith dealing and a history of predatory acquisition practices. The filing made local news first, then regional, then national. Suddenly, Marcus's story wasn't just about a mining dispute. It was about corporate corruption, suspicious deaths, and a David versus Goliath battle playing out in the Colorado mountains. Public opinion shifted. Environmental groups reached out offering support. A documentarian started filming. Even some of Summit's former partners came forward with their own stories of aggressive tactics and forced buyouts. The pressure mounted, but Summit didn't back down. Instead, they escalated. Marcus started noticing vehicles following him when he drove into town. His cabin was broken into, nothing stolen, just tossed, like someone had been searching for something. The mine entrance was vandalized, equipment damaged, warning messages spray-painted on the timber supports. "Walk away. You can't win." Samuel learned the hard way. The threats were no longer subtle. They were designed to intimidate, to wear him down, psychologically, until selling seemed like the only safe option. Sarah hired private security to patrol the property. Dale, from the gas station, organized a volunteer watch, local men taking shifts, to make sure no one approached the mine unsupervised. Even Garrett showed up, his old pickup loaded with supplies. "Your grandfather saved my life once," he said gruffly when Marcus thanked him. "Pulled me out of a collapsed tunnel back in '68. I owe him. And I owe Samuel. So, I'm staying until this is finished." The community was splitting. Some supported Marcus, saw him as protecting something important. Others resented the attention, the disruption, the way this discovery was dividing the town. Ruth's Diner put up a sign, "We don't serve troublemakers." But the cafe across the street countered with their own, "We serve people fighting for what's right." Copper Ridge was being forced to choose sides, and not everyone was choosing Marcus. Then came the fire. It started just after midnight on a Tuesday. Marcus woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling flames. He stumbled outside to see the storage shed near the mine entrance, fully engulfed, fire leaping 30 feet into the night sky. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived from town, the shed was gone. Along with $10,000 worth of equipment Marcus couldn't afford to replace. The fire marshal ruled it arson. Accelerant had been used, but there were no witnesses, no security footage, no evidence pointing to anyone specific. Marcus stood in the ashes the next morning, exhausted and furious, staring at the charred remains of his grandfather's tools. Sarah found him there. "They're not going to stop," she said quietly. "They think, if they make this painful enough, expensive enough, dangerous enough, you'll break." "Maybe they're right," Marcus admitted. "Maybe I should just take their money and walk away. Let someone else deal with this." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I tell you something my father told me when I was deciding whether to become a lawyer? He said, the only fights worth having are the ones where you're scared. Because fear means it matters. Means you're risking something real for something that could change things." She looked at the burned shed. "You're scared. I get it. But you're also standing here, still fighting, which tells me you already know what your grandfather knew. Some things are worth protecting even when it costs everything." Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not courage, exactly. More like clarity. He'd been thinking about this wrong, framing it as a choice between wealth and principle, between safety and honor. But it wasn't a choice. It never had been. Because if he walked away, if he let Summit win, then his grandfather's 40 years meant nothing. Samuel's death meant nothing. And Marcus himself, standing in the ashes of something he was trying to protect, meant nothing. He wasn't fighting for money, or property, or even legacy. He was fighting for the idea that power doesn't always win, that sometimes, when you're outmatched and outspent and scared out of your mind, you stand anyway. Because that's what it means to be human. That's what it means to matter. "Okay," Marcus said. "Then, let's fight." Sarah smiled. "Good, because I've been working on something." She pulled out her phone and showed him an email. It was from a coalition of environmental groups, Native American tribes with ancestral claims to the region, and academic institutions interested in preserving the deposit for research. They were offering to provide legal support, expert testimony, and public advocacy in exchange for Marcus agreeing to place the mine under a conservation trust. "It's called a community mineral trust," Sarah explained. "You'd maintain legal ownership, but extraction and use would be governed by a board representing multiple stakeholders. Any profits would be split. Some for you, some for you. Community development. Some for ongoing research and preservation. It's not perfect, but it protects the deposit from being strip mined, gives you resources to fight Summit, and creates a framework that courts tend to look favorably on." Marcus read through the proposal. It wasn't what he'd imagined when he first inherited the mine. It meant giving up control, accepting oversight, sharing something that legally belonged only to him. But it also meant his grandfather's vision, the one outlined in that letter in the cathedral chamber, could actually happen. The deposit could be used for good, not just profit. "What do we need to do?" he asked. "We file the trust paperwork, get it approved by the court, and present it as an alternative to Summit's claims. We argue that your proposed use of the property serves public interest, which gives you stronger legal standing." Sarah paused. "But Marcus, once you do this, you can't undo it. You're essentially committing to a path that limits your personal gain in favor of collective benefit. You need to be sure." Marcus thought about his grandfather, alone in this cabin for 40 years, carrying a secret that could have made him wealthy beyond imagination, but choosing poverty and isolation instead. He thought about Samuel, dead in a tunnel, because he believed in doing things right, and he thought about himself, standing in the ashes of a burned shed, choosing whether to be the kind of man who runs or the kind who stands. "I'm sure," he said. They filed the paperwork the next day. The response was immediate and explosive. Summit Mining issued a statement calling the trust proposal a transparent attempt to circumvent legitimate ownership claims and a dangerous precedent that threatens private property rights. They filed emergency motions arguing that the trust structure was being used to shield assets from rightful claimants. And they sent Richard Sutton himself to Copper Ridge for one final offer. He showed up at the cabin, On a Friday morning, alone this time, without the entourage of lawyers and corporate muscle, just him, looking tired and surprisingly human. "Can we talk?" he asked. Marcus almost said no. But something about the way Sutton stood there, stripped of his usual arrogance, made him curious. They sat on the porch, two men on opposite sides of a battle. Neither of them had started, but both were now committed to finishing. "I've been with Summit for 23 years, Sutton said after a long silence. "Worked my way up from junior counsel to chief legal officer. I've closed hundreds of acquisitions, negotiated thousands of contracts. I'm very good at my job." He looked out at the mountains. "But I've never been asked to win at any cost before. Never been told that failure wasn't an option, that I should use every tactic available, regardless of ethics or legality. Until this case." He turned to Marcus. "You want to know why Summit is so determined to get this mine? Why they're willing to burn your property, threaten you, drag this through courts for years?" "I assumed it was the money," Marcus said. Sutton laughed bitterly. "It's always money, but it's more than that. Summit was on the verge of bankruptcy in the late 70s. They'd made bad investments, over-leveraged themselves. This deposit, if they'd secured it back then, would have saved the company, made them industry leaders. Instead, your grandfather sealed it, and they nearly collapsed. They survived, but barely. And the executives who were in charge back then, some of them, are still on the board, still angry, still obsessed with finishing what they started 40 years ago." He pulled out a document. "I'm here without authorization. If my bosses knew I was talking to you, I'd be fired. Maybe worse. But I need you to understand something. They will never stop. Even if you win in court, even if you establish the trust, they'll appeal. They'll file new motions. They'll find ways to delay and obstruct until you run out of money or willpower or both. That's what they do. That's what they've always done." "So why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. "Because 23 years ago, when I was starting out, I had a mentor, a senior partner who taught me that being a good lawyer meant more than winning. It meant knowing when the fight itself was destroying what you were trying to protect." Sutton's voice was quiet. "I've watched what this is doing to you, to this town, to everyone involved. And I keep thinking about Samuel, the man who died in that mine, and wondering if we're all just repeating history." He stood up. "Here's what I can offer. Not as Summit's lawyer, but as someone who's tired of being on the wrong side. If you take your trust proposal and go directly to the state attorney general's office, file it as a conservation initiative with public interest protections, they might take jurisdiction away from the regular courts. Elevate it to a state-level review. That would neutralize Summit's ability to delay through procedural tactics." "Why would you help me?" Marcus asked, stunned. "Because I have a daughter," Sutton said, "and I want her to grow up in a world where occasionally, just occasionally, the good guys win." He walked to his car, then paused. "One more thing. You should know that Summit's board is meeting next week to discuss, quote, alternative enforcement strategies. I don't know what that means exactly, but based on the people attending, it won't be legal." He drove away, leaving Marcus sitting on the porch, with a head full of questions and a heart full of something that might have been hope. Sarah arrived an hour later, and Marcus told her everything. She listened, expression unreadable, then nodded slowly. "Sutton's right about the Attorney General route. It's risky because it means state oversight and restrictions you can't control, but it also means protection, real protection." She looked at Marcus. "But if Summit is planning something illegal, if they're desperate enough to step outside the law entirely, we need to be ready. We need to document everything, have witnesses present, maybe even contact federal authorities." "You think they'd actually try something?" Marcus asked. "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that we're talking about people who've already killed once to protect this secret. People who've spent 40 years obsessed with acquiring something they believe belongs to them. And people like that, when they're cornered, when they're losing in court and in public opinion. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He walked to the mine entrance, past the security volunteers, past the burned remains of the storage shed, and stood at the threshold of the darkness his grandfather had guarded for so long. He pulled out his flashlight and descended into the mountain one more time, through the main tunnel, past the sealed chambers, down to the cathedral room, where $300 million worth of mineral formation glowed in the darkness like frozen starlight. He stood in the center of that impossible space, surrounded by the legacy his grandfather had protected at the cost of everything, and made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for Summit to make their move. He wasn't going to be a passive target, hoping the law would protect him. He was going to go on the offensive, and he knew exactly how to do it. Marcus called a town meeting. Not through official channels, not through the mayor's office that had long ago chosen Summit's side. He simply stood in the parking lot of Dale's gas station at noon on a Saturday and started talking. Word spread fast in a town of 342 people. Within an hour, nearly 200 had gathered, some curious, some hostile, all of them tired of the conflict that had been tearing Copper Ridge apart for months. Marcus stood on the bed of his pickup truck. No microphone, no prepared speech, just a man trying to explain himself to neighbors who'd watched his struggle with everything from sympathy to contempt. "I know most of you wish I'd never come here," he began. "I know this discovery has brought nothing but trouble. News crews, lawyers, attention nobody wanted. I know some of you have lost work because Summit's threatening to pull out of the region entirely if I don't sell. And I know that makes me the enemy in a lot of your eyes." He paused, looking at the faces below. Some were nodding. Others had arms crossed, waiting. "But here's what I need you to understand. My grandfather, Vincent Brennan, he lived up in those mountains for 40 years, protecting something he believed was too important to sell to the highest bidder. He could have been rich, could have lived anywhere, done anything. Instead, he stayed here, alone, poor, carrying a secret that cost him everything, including his relationship with his own family." Marcus's voice grew stronger. He did that because he believed this deposit belonged to more than just him, that it could mean something beyond profit. "And before he died, he left me a letter asking me to make sure it got used right. Not just for me, but for communities, for research, for future generations." He pulled out the trust documents Sarah had prepared. "So I'm not here to ask your permission. The mine is legally mine. But I am here to offer you something. A partnership. A community mineral trust, where extraction and use gets decided by a board that includes representatives from this town, from environmental groups, from native tribes with ancestral claims, from universities, where profits get split between continued research, community development, and yes, some for me, because I'd be lying if I said I didn't need it." He looked directly at Ruth, the diner owner who'd refused to serve him. "I know Summit employed people here. I know they've been part of this town's economy for decades. But I also know they've threatened you, manipulated you, made you dependent on them, so you'd fight their battles. And I'm offering you a chance to break free of that. To build something that belongs to all of us. Not just distant shareholders who've never set foot in Copper Ridge." The crowd was silent. Then Dale stepped forward. "What kind of community development are we talking about?" "Schools," Marcus said. "Infrastructure. Small business grants. Whatever this town decides it needs. The trust would establish a fund, and local representatives would control how it gets spent. It wouldn't be me deciding. It would be you." A woman, Marcus recognized from the post office, spoke up. "And what about Summit? They're not going to just accept this. They'll fight, and we'll be caught in the middle." "They're already fighting," Marcus replied. "And you're already in the middle. The question is whether you're in the middle of their fight or part of building something different." He held up the trust documents. I'm filing this with the State Attorney General's office on Monday. It'll take the decision out of local courts and put it under state jurisdiction as a conservation initiative. That means Summit's delay tactics won't work. We'll get a resolution, one way or another, within 6 months, and if the state approves the trust, Summit loses any claim they had. More silence. Then Garrett spoke from the back of the crowd, his gravelly voice carrying. Vincent Brennan pulled me from a collapsed tunnel 41 years ago. Could have left me there, saved himself first. He didn't. He went back in, nearly died getting me out. That's the kind of man he was. And if his grandson's offering us a piece of what Vincent protected all those years, then I'm saying we'd be fools not to take it. Others began to murmur. Some in agreement, some still skeptical. But the tone had shifted. Marcus wasn't the enemy anymore. He was just a man trying to honor his grandfather's wish and offering to include them in the outcome. The meeting broke up without a clear consensus, but something had changed. People stopped crossing the street when they saw Marcus. A few even nodded in greeting. And when Summit's representatives tried to hold their own town meeting the following week, fewer than 20 people showed up. The tide was turning. Marcus filed the trust paperwork on Monday morning. By Wednesday, the State Attorney General's office had accepted jurisdiction, citing significant public interest in the proper stewardship of rare mineral resources. Summit filed emergency appeals, but they were denied. For the first time in months, Marcus had the advantage. Then, everything went wrong. It happened on a Thursday night. Marcus was at the cabin, reviewing geological reports when he heard engines, multiple vehicles, coming fast up the access road. He grabbed his phone to call Sarah, but realized there was no signal. The cell tower had been acting up all day. Convenient timing. He grabbed his grandfather's shotgun and stepped onto the porch. 6 trucks rolled into the clearing, headlights blazing. Men poured out, maybe 15 of them, wearing private security uniforms and carrying equipment that looked more military than civilian. At the front stood Cole, but his usual corporate polish was gone. He looked desperate, dangerous. "Step aside, Brennan," Cole shouted. "We have authorization to secure the mine pending appeal resolution. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Authorization from who? Marcus demanded, though he already knew. Summit had gotten a friendly judge somewhere to issue an ex parte order, probably in the middle of the night, claiming emergency circumstances. "Doesn't matter," Cole said. "The order's legal. We're taking possession of the mine. You can fight it in court on Monday, but tonight, it's ours." Marcus raised the shotgun. "This is still my property." "You're trespassing, and you're outnumbered," Cole replied. "I've got 15 armed men with legal authority. You've got a hunting rifle and stubbornness. Do the math." For a moment, Marcus actually considered it. Considered pulling the trigger, starting something that would end badly for everyone. But then he heard something else. More engines, coming from the other direction, from town. He glanced over his shoulder and felt his chest tighten. Trucks were pouring up the access road. Old pickups, jeeps, even a few motorcycles. And in them were people from Copper Ridge. Dale leading the convoy in his ancient Ford. Garrett in his rust-bucket Chevy. Ruth from the diner. The woman from the post office. The mechanic who'd fixed Marcus's truck. Even Elena from the assessor's office. Dozens of them, maybe 50, forming a human barrier between Summit's security force and the mine entrance. Dale stepped out, a tire iron in his hand. "You boys looking to start something?" Cole's expression shifted from confident to uncertain. "This is a legal matter. You're interfering with what?" Dale interrupted. "With you trying to steal something that belongs to this town, that belongs to all of us now? I don't think so." He looked at the security team. "You know what the cell phone outage means. Means someone cut the tower deliberately. Means this wasn't a legal operation, it was a raid. And we've got cameras recording every second of it." He held up his phone, screen glowing. Others did the same. 15 cameras, documenting everything. Cole's face went pale. He looked at his security team, then back at the growing crowd, and realized he'd been outmaneuvered. If they forced their way through now, with this many witnesses recording, Summit couldn't claim legal authority. It would be exposed as exactly what it was: corporate theft dressed up as legal procedure. "Fall back," Cole said quietly to his team. "This isn't over," he said to Marcus, but his voice lacked conviction. The trucks reversed, turned around, and disappeared down the mountain. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Marcus just stood there, overwhelmed. These people, many of whom had resented him weeks ago, had just put themselves between him and a corporate security force, had just chosen his side. Dale walked up onto the porch. "Your grandfather would have been proud," he said simply. "Thank you," Marcus managed, his throat tight. "Don't thank me yet," Dale replied with a slight smile. "Wait till you see the bill for fixing that cell tower." The next morning, footage of the confrontation was everywhere. Local news picked it up first, then regional, then national. Video of armed security forces being turned back by a small mountain town, protecting one of their own, became a viral sensation. Summit mining stock dropped 12% in a single day. The blowback was immediate and severe. 3 members of Summit's board resigned. Richard Sutton, who'd warned Marcus about the company's plans, publicly broke with the company and released internal documents showing a pattern of illegal intimidation tactics. The documents confirmed what Helen had suspected 40 years ago. Summit had been involved in Samuel's death, had covered it up, and had spent decades trying to finish what they'd started. Federal prosecutors opened an investigation. Civil lawsuits were filed by other small operators Summit had victimized over the years, and the state attorney general, facing massive public pressure, fast-tracked the community trust review. 6 weeks later, Marcus stood in the state capitol building as the attorney general signed the order, officially recognizing the Copper Ridge Mineral Trust. The mine, the deposit, everything his grandfather had protected, was now legally preserved for community benefit and scientific research. Summit's claims were dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never be refiled. It was over. Marcus had won. But standing there, surrounded by lawyers and officials and camera flashes, he didn't feel victorious. He felt exhausted, grateful, and somehow lighter, like a weight he'd been carrying since that first day at the mine entrance had finally lifted. Sarah stood beside him, beaming. "You did it," she said. "We did it," Marcus corrected. "I couldn't have done this alone." That was the truth. The victory belonged to everyone who'd stood with him. Sarah and her tireless legal work, Helen and her courage in coming forward, Dale and the townspeople who'd physically put themselves on the line, even Sutton, who'd risked everything to do the right thing at the end. The trust was established with a 7-member board. Marcus as primary trustee, Elena representing local government, Dr. Chen from the School of Mines representing research institutions, a representative from the Northern Ute tribe, an environmental advocate, Dale representing community interests, and Sarah as legal counsel. Their first meeting was held not in some corporate boardroom, but in Dale's gas station, sitting on folding chairs, drinking coffee from styrofoam cups. They drafted guidelines for extraction, ensuring that most of the cathedral chamber would remain intact as a natural monument, while allowing limited, precision harvesting from smaller veins. They established a fund for community development with an initial allocation of $5 million, money Marcus borrowed against the deposit's verified value, and they voted to name the preserved formation the Vincent and Samuel Memorial Geological Site, honoring both men who discovered it and paid the price. The transformation of Copper Ridge didn't happen overnight, but it happened steadily. The first project, funded by the Trust, was a new school, replacing the building that had been falling apart since the 1960s. Then came infrastructure, repaved roads, updated water systems, high-speed internet. Small business grants brought new shops and services. Young families who'd left started coming back. The population that had been slowly dying began to grow. A research station was built near the mine, hosting rotating teams of geologists, mineralogists, and students from universities around the world. Tours were offered on weekends, carefully managed to protect the formation while allowing people to witness something extraordinary. And Marcus, the broke construction worker who'd inherited a burden he'd never asked for, became something unexpected. A steward, not of wealth, but of legacy. He moved out of the old cabin and into a modest house in town. Nothing fancy, just enough space for a life he was finally ready to build. He hired a small staff to help manage the trust operations, and spent his days splitting time between administrative work and what he'd always loved, working with his hands, helping maintain the mine, training new researchers in safe access procedures. On the one-year anniversary of the Trust's establishment, a ceremony was held at the mine entrance. A bronze plaque was mounted on the rock face, with Vincent's words from that letter in the cathedral chamber. Some things are more valuable than money. Legacy matters, honor matters, and the way you handle power says more about who you are than anything else in life. Marcus stood before the gathered crowd, townspeople, researchers, reporters, and thought about how far he'd come. A year ago, he'd been standing in this exact spot, alone, desperate, staring into darkness and uncertainty. Now he stood, surrounded by community, purpose, and something that felt like home. Dale approached him after the ceremony, pressed a worn envelope into his hands. "Your grandfather left this with me 20 years ago," he said. "Told me to give it to whoever inherited the mine if they proved worthy. Guess you proved it." Marcus opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single photograph and a note. The photo showed Vincent as a young man, maybe Marcus's age, standing beside someone who must have been Samuel, both grinning at the camera, both covered in mineral dust that glowed faintly even in the old picture. The note read, "If you're reading this, then you chose right. You chose the hard path, the honorable path, the path that costs everything and gives back something that can't be measured in dollars. I'm proud of you. I always knew you had it in you, even when we barely knew each other. Blood runs deep. Character runs deeper. Take care of this mountain. Take care of these people, and take care of yourself. You've earned it. With love and respect, Vincent." Marcus's vision blurred. He folded the note carefully, tucked it back into the envelope, and pressed it against his chest. He looked up at the mountain, at the mine entrance that had given him purpose, at the town that had become his home, at the legacy his grandfather had trusted him to protect. And he understood finally what Vincent had been trying to teach him all along. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the mineral deposit, rare and valuable as it was. It was about the choice. Every single day, you wake up and choose what kind of person you're going to be. You choose whether to take the easy path or the right one, whether to think only of yourself or consider the generations that come after, whether to let fear make you small or let courage make you something bigger than you ever imagined. Vincent had made that choice 40 years ago, in the darkness of a mine where he'd discovered something extraordinary. He'd chosen protection over profit, isolation over compromise, legacy over comfort, and he'd paid for that choice with everything he had. But he'd also given Marcus something more valuable than $300 million. He'd given him a chance to prove what kind of man he could become. Marcus took one last look at the plaque, at his grandfather's words carved into stone, and smiled. He'd spent the last year fighting, struggling, nearly losing everything, but he'd also found himself, found community, found purpose. And in doing so, He'd honored a legacy that would outlive them all. 6 months later, on a cold morning in early spring, Marcus stood at Vincent's grave in the small cemetery at the edge of town. He'd brought flowers, white lilies that his grandfather had apparently loved, though Marcus had never known it. He'd learned so much about Vincent in the past year, small details from townspeople who remembered him, stories that painted a picture of a complex, principled man who'd lived quietly but meant enormously. "We finished what you started," Marcus said to the weathered headstone. "The trust is running smoothly, the town's coming back to life, and the mine, your mine, it's protected, just like you wanted. Scientists are studying it, learning from it. Kids are touring it, getting inspired by it. And your name, both your names, yours and Samuel's, they're remembered." He paused, emotion catching in his throat. "I wish I'd known you better. Wish I'd had more time to understand what you were carrying all those years. But I get it now. I understand why. You did what you did, and I promise you, I'll keep doing it. For as long as I'm able, I'll make sure this legacy means something, that it helps people, that it stands for something more than profit." The wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the pines, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. And in that moment, Marcus felt something he'd been chasing since he first arrived in Copper Ridge. He felt peace, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of purpose. Not certainty about the future, but confidence in the present. He'd inherited a mine worth $300 million, but what he'd really inherited was the chance to become someone worth remembering. Anyone can discover buried treasure if they're lucky enough to dig in the right place at the right time. But it takes something deeper, something stronger, to turn that discovery into a legacy that outlives you. It takes courage to stand against power, when power has every advantage. It takes faith to believe that doing right matters more than doing well. It takes heart to choose the hard path, when easy money is staring you in the face. And it takes wisdom to understand that the most valuable inheritance isn't what's buried in the ground. It's the strength to stand up and say, "This matters more than me, more than my comfort, more than my fear." As Marcus Brennan walked back to his truck, leaving flowers on his grandfather's grave and carrying the weight of a legacy he was now proud to bear, he understood something that Vincent had known all along. Some secrets are worth protecting, some fights are worth having, and some legacies are worth every sacrifice it takes to preserve them. Because in the end, we're not measured by what we take from the earth. We're measured by what we leave behind for those who come after. And for Marcus, for Vincent, for everyone who'd fought to protect something bigger than themselves, that legacy was just beginning. The mountain remained, patient and eternal, holding its secrets close. The town continued growing, building, thriving. The trust operated with integrity and purpose. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the Colorado peaks, a cathedral of glowing stone waited, preserved for generations who would come seeking wonder and finding proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the right people win. Not because they're the strongest or the richest or the most powerful, but because they refuse to give up on the idea that some things are sacred, that honor still matters. That one person, standing alone against impossible odds, can change everything if they're stubborn enough to believe in something bigger than themselves. Marcus had inherited his grandfather's abandoned mine, but what he found inside that sealed tunnel wasn't just $300 million worth of rare mineral deposit. It was the answer to a question every person must face. What kind of legacy will you leave? And Marcus Brennan, the broke mountain man who'd arrived in Copper Ridge with nothing but grief and debt, had answered that question in the only way that mattered. With courage, with honor, with a fierce determination to protect what his grandfather had died defending. The mine belonged to the future, now. But the story, the legacy, the proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose what's right over what's easy, that belonged to everyone. Up next, two more incredible stories of courage, discovery, and the legacies we choose to leave behind. Click to continue the journey with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones we find, but the ones we protect.